I'm Jack, 28, and I've been feeling like a ghost in my own family for as long as I can remember. Growing up, my parents always made it painfully obvious who the favorite was, and it wasn't me. My younger brother, Kyle, has been treated like he's some sort of golden child from the moment he was born, and I guess I was supposed to just accept that my achievements, my hard work, and even my dreams were somehow less important because I didn't have a family of my own yet. It's funny because I actually do have a family. My life isn't empty, but apparently, in their eyes, not being married with kids makes me invisible, or maybe just expendable. The latest incident happened over what should have been a routine family dinner. My dad, in his usual pompous tone, had the gall to lay it all out in front of everyone. Jack, you're too young to understand, but your brother deserves the inheritance. He has a family. He has responsibilities. You'll have your time someday. Everyone nodded. Everyone agreed. My Aunt Lisa even smiled at him like he was some kind of visionary. I felt my stomach twist, half with frustration and half with this dull, familiar pain that always comes when my family talks about me like I'm a guest in my own home. I stayed quiet, sipping my water, pretending I didn't hear them. But inside, I was boiling. Every word felt like a slap. The way my father phrased it, my brother's life mattered more than mine. My accomplishments, my struggles, my late nights working to save money for my own apartment, nothing counted. It was like I had to watch from the sidelines as everyone celebrated Kyle for just being married and having 2 kids. My Aunt Lisa leaned forward, eyes glinting with curiosity, clearly waiting for me to show some sort of gratitude or at least acknowledgement. But I didn't. Instead, I opened my laptop. I wanted to keep calm, wanted to appear casual, like I wasn't about to throw a wrench into their perfect little moral hierarchy. But inside, I had a plan forming, a plan to make them realize that the way they've treated me, the way they've underestimated me, would have consequences. The screen lit up my face, casting a pale glow as my fingers hovered over the keyboard. Interesting you mentioned family. I muttered under my breath, just loud enough for my brother to hear. His smug grin faltered slightly, and I knew I had his attention. Because here's something you might not remember about your last inheritance. The room fell quiet. My dad's eyebrows shot up. Aunt Lisa leaned closer, peering at the screen with a frown. Kyle's confident posture wavered for a second, as if sensing that the narrative they had built around him, the perfect son, the deserving one, might be about to crack. I kept my tone calm, deliberate, letting the tension hang in the air. I didn't yell, didn't accuse, didn't plead. I just clicked, and suddenly, a series of images and documents filled the screen. Proof of how Kyle had squandered his last inheritance on a series of reckless investments, risky purchases, and a few questionable business ventures that had lost him more money than I'd ever seen him earn. There was a pause, just long enough for the silence to press on everyone's chest. Aunt Lisa's hand hovered near her mouth, eyes widening as she scrolled through the evidence. My dad opened his mouth, probably ready to try and save face, but I raised a finger, signaling him to hold. You all mentioned family, right? I said, my voice steady, almost casual, though my pulse was racing. Let's talk about how Kyle treated his family responsibilities the last time he was entrusted with something important. I watched as disbelief slowly replaced confidence across the table. Kyle's eyes darted from me to the screen, then back to my dad, trying to find some support, some excuse. But the proof was undeniable. Receipts, contracts, even photos of the events that led to him losing a significant portion of his inheritance. They all told the story that my family had somehow missed. The irony was almost delicious. All those lectures about responsibility, all the times they compared me unfavorably to him, all the nods and approving smiles at his maturity and family sense, they were staring at a man who had mismanaged what he'd been given, while the so-called invisible son had been quietly building his own life, responsibly and independently. Aunt Lisa finally spoke, her voice tight with tension. Jack, where did you get these? Her eyes flicked nervously between me and Kyle. My dad's hands clenched around his fork, knuckles white, and for the first time in years, I saw hesitation in his eyes. Kyle's mouth opened, closed, opened again, as if trying to come up with an explanation, but none came. I leaned back, letting the moment stretch. I didn't need to say more. I had planted the seed. The look on their faces was confirmation enough that the perfect narrative they had built around Kyle, the one where I was unworthy, invisible, and undeserving, was crumbling. I don't know if they realized it yet, but this was just the beginning. They might have thought they could dismiss me, overlook my achievements, and heap praise on my brother while treating me like an afterthought. But now, the tables were subtly turning. I wasn't going to ruin anyone in a tantrum, and I wasn't going to beg for recognition. I had something better. The truth, undeniable and painfully visible, sitting right in front of them on a screen. And as I sat there, watching my father's smug confidence falter, I realized something else. This wasn't just about money or inheritance. It was about acknowledgement, about finally being seen in a family that had spent decades pretending I didn't matter. I had their attention now, and I intended to make the most of it. Slowly, deliberately, I closed my laptop, letting the click echo in the tense silence. Well, I said lightly. Interesting to see how family responsibilities can play out differently depending on the person, isn't it? No one said anything at first. The weight of the evidence lingered in the air like a storm ready to break. Kyle's lips twitched, probably trying to find a way to salvage his image. My dad's jaw tightened, and Aunt Lisa's eyes narrowed as she glanced at me, a mix of suspicion and unease. And that's when I knew. The family dinner had just shifted from a polite, obligatory gathering to the beginning of something much larger. Something that I would carefully orchestrate. Something they would never forget. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, and I didn't lose control. I just let them stew in the reality I'd laid before them. And as I quietly sipped my water, pretending to be calm, I felt a thrill of satisfaction. The first seed of doubt had been planted, and from here, the story was only going to get more complicated. They had underestimated me for years, assumed I was naive, assumed I would accept my lesser role without question. But now, they were going to see that the invisible son had been quietly watching, quietly planning, and quietly waiting for the right moment to challenge everything they thought they knew. I smiled faintly, letting my expression be calm, almost innocent. But inside, my mind was racing with possibilities. There would be conversations, confrontations, and probably some very awkward family gatherings in the future. Kyle would squirm, my dad would fume, and Aunt Lisa, well, she would probably try to play peacemaker, but I could already tell she would be on edge. And the best part? I hadn't even begun my real move yet. This dinner was just the setup. As I pushed back my chair, preparing to leave the table with a casual grace, I glanced at my brother one last time. His confident posture had vanished, replaced by a tight, controlled tension that betrayed how rattled he actually was. My dad avoided my gaze completely, staring down at his plate as if he could will the embarrassment away. Aunt Lisa's sharp eyes lingered on me, and I knew she was already asking herself how she had failed to see this coming. And in that quiet, charged moment, I realized something crucial. The story my family had written about me, the story where I was insignificant, unworthy, and invisible, was about to be rewritten. I didn't need to raise my voice, make a scene, or beg for respect. All I needed was patience, strategy, and a little bit of their own arrogance working against them. After that dinner, things didn't just simmer down, they boiled over. It was as if the little crack I had created in their carefully constructed family narrative had enraged them, though they couldn't openly admit it. The next few weeks were unbearable, a combination of passive-aggressive remarks, cold shoulders, and thinly veiled lectures disguised as concern. Every interaction became a minefield, and my own house, where I usually felt safe, started to feel like a refuge I had to retreat to more often. The favoritism toward Kyle intensified almost immediately. It was subtle at first, Dad asking Kyle for advice about investments, praising him in conversations with friends, or sending him texts about family matters before even bothering to mention them to me. Then it escalated. During a weekend family barbecue, my father handed Kyle a brand new car key with a grin, saying, "For someone with responsibilities, unlike some of us." My stomach turned, my hands clenched, but I forced a smile and congratulated him. I felt the humiliation wrap around me like a thick fog as everyone else cheered and my father patted Kyle on the back. I wasn't even allowed a word of recognition for the promotion I'd just gotten at work, which had taken years of effort. Aunt Lisa was no better. She started making passive comments whenever we were together, little jabs hidden under the guise of concern. "Jack, don't you think you should focus more on settling down? You know, family comes first." I'd smile tightly, nod, and walk away, but inside I was seething. Every word was a reminder that, to them, My accomplishments meant nothing, and I was still just a placeholder until I conformed to their expectations. Even my mother, who I thought might have some loyalty to me, had begun echoing their sentiment. She would glance at Kyle with pride while brushing past me, saying things like, "I just hope you'll understand someday, Jack. He's been through a lot more than you realize." It was condescending, and I wanted nothing more than to tell her that I understood perfectly, and that her words hurt more than any insult ever could. Then came the betrayal. It was subtle, almost accidental in the way they delivered it, but the impact was devastating. My brother had invited me over under the guise of showing me his new business venture, a joint investment with some local entrepreneurs. I had cautiously agreed, thinking maybe this was a chance to reconnect, to at least be included in a family conversation without judgment. I knocked on his door, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach, and was greeted with his usual smug grin. "Jack, glad you could make it," he said, gesturing toward the living room where a few other family members were already seated. "Dad mentioned you might be interested." His tone was light, almost mocking, but I forced myself to return a neutral smile. The room was full of people, mostly my father's friends and some distant relatives I barely recognized. They were all nodding toward me politely, but I could feel the weight of their judgment, the silent understanding that I didn't belong here, that I was just a visitor observing the real family in action. Kyle leaned back on the sofa, the picture of composure, while I was offered a chair at the far end of the room. As the conversation started, I realized too late what was happening. Kyle was presenting his new venture like he was some kind of visionary, speaking confidently about investments, partnerships, and the projected returns. But as he spoke, I noticed discrepancies, things that didn't add up, errors he had obviously overlooked or intentionally misrepresented. My heart sank when I saw him subtly passing around documents that weren't just misleading, they were outright manipulations of previous agreements. And then it hit me. He had involved my father and aunt in this scheme without telling me, making me look like the outsider once again. I tried to intervene politely at first, pointing out the errors, asking for clarifications, but every time I spoke, he would brush me off, smirk, or turn the conversation towards some joke about me being out of touch or not understanding the real business world. My father chuckled nervously at the jokes, and Aunt Lisa leaned in with a fake smile, nodding at everything Kyle said. It was intentional. They were all complicit. I felt my chest tighten, a mix of betrayal, humiliation, and anger washing over me in waves. This wasn't just favoritism anymore. It was a coordinated effort to sideline me, to make me look foolish while celebrating my brother. The breaking point came when Kyle casually mentioned a trip he had taken recently, one that I had only learned about through the grapevine. He described how he had used a portion of our father's gift, the inheritance that was all his, to fund a lavish vacation for his family. He spoke with pride about the luxury villas, the fine dining, and the exclusive excursions, all while making sure to emphasize how responsible he had been in budgeting it. My stomach churned as I realized the depth of his audacity. This was the money my family had spent years convincing me was too valuable for someone like me, money that I had been excluded from discussing or even mentioning, and he had blown a significant portion on indulgence. I couldn't take it anymore. My voice rose slightly, controlled but unmistakable, and I asked him directly, "Kyle, what about the people who were supposed to benefit from this inheritance? The extended family, the charity fund Dad mentioned last year? Did they get any of this?" The room went silent. Kyle froze, his confident mask slipping for just a fraction of a second before he recovered with a laugh. "Oh, come on, Jack. That's old news. It's not like anyone really needed it, and we're all better off this way." He shrugged, as if dismissing the responsibility entirely. My father's face went pale, and Aunt Lisa's hand flew to her mouth. It was one thing for Kyle to look foolish on his own. It was another for him to openly disregard the family's expectations in front of everyone, especially while including me in the room. And the worst part? They weren't defending me. None of them were. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that I wasn't just excluded from the conversation. I was actively being undermined, humiliated, and erased. I wanted to lash out, to scream, to make them see the injustice, but I held it together. My heart pounded in my chest. My hands trembled slightly, but I forced myself to take a deep breath and sit back, letting the weight of my fury simmer. I could feel the anger coiling inside me like a spring, ready to be released at the right moment. This wasn't about childish revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my place in a family that had spent years pretending I didn't matter. After the meeting, I walked home in a daze, replaying every interaction, every smug grin, every dismissive comment. I realized that this was bigger than I thought. It wasn't just favoritism. It was a coordinated effort to maintain a hierarchy where Kyle was untouchable and I was expendable. My father had literally declared my inheritance off limits. My aunt had nodded in agreement, and my brother had shamelessly misused the money while keeping me in the dark. By the time I reached my apartment, I knew I couldn't let this go. I wasn't going to confront them in anger, not yet. That would only make me predictable, easy to dismiss. No, I needed a plan. I needed to make them see the consequences of underestimating me, of treating me as if I didn't belong. And more than that, I needed them to understand that I had been watching all along, quietly, patiently, and with a sharp memory for every slight, every insult, every deliberate exclusion. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop again, the familiar glow illuminating my determined face. I started gathering evidence, making careful notes, and tracing back every instance of favoritism, mismanagement, and hypocrisy. I wasn't going to act recklessly. I needed strategy, patience, and precision. This wasn't about immediate satisfaction. It was about making sure they couldn't ignore me again. As the night deepened, I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself a small, private smile. They thought they could dismiss me, humiliate me, and keep me in the background forever. But now I knew the truth. The scales were beginning to tip. The breaking point had arrived, and I could feel it in my bones. Everything that had happened, the favoritism, the snide remarks, the exclusion, the betrayal, had led me here. I was no longer just the ignored son. I was someone who had seen the whole picture, someone who had the patience and cunning to turn it to my advantage. The days after that dinner and Kyle's betrayal felt heavier than anything I had experienced in a long time. I went through the motions at work, but my mind kept replaying the scene over and over. The smug way Kyle had dismissed my questions, the forced smiles of my parents, Aunt Lisa's silent complicity. Every time I thought about it, I felt this mix of rage and hurt that refused to subside. It wasn't just the money. It was the principle, the years of subtle and not-so-subtle messages that I didn't matter, that I would always be second, that my life, my choices, my hard work, none of it would ever be enough to earn the respect I deserved. I think that was the lowest point. The realization that the people I had trusted the most, the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, had actively sided against me. I couldn't even turn to my mother for support anymore. She had started echoing their opinions about Kyle being more responsible and family-oriented, and I knew she genuinely believed it. It wasn't malice on her part, at least not all of it, but it was another blow, another reminder that I was invisible in the eyes of my family. I had nowhere to go, no one to lean on, and no outlet for my frustration that wouldn't be dismissed as whining or jealousy. For the first time in a long time, I cried. Not quietly, not in private, but really let the weight of everything hit me. I sank to my bedroom floor, staring at the carpet and thinking about all the moments I had been dismissed, belittled, and overlooked. Every birthday where Kyle got the best gift and I got a polite card. Every holiday where my accomplishments were ignored in favor of his. Every conversation where my opinions were dismissed. I felt like a ghost in my own life. And for a few days, I allowed myself to stay there, to wallow, to feel the sting and bitterness fully. But, as much as it hurt, something else began to emerge from the wreckage. A quiet, burning determination. I realized that if I continued to let them define my worth, I would be perpetually trapped in this cycle of humiliation and invisibility. I had to take control, not by fighting them directly or demanding recognition, but by quietly rebuilding myself, by proving to myself first and foremost that I mattered, that I was capable of more than they had ever allowed me to believe. I started small. I spent more hours at work, not obsessively, but strategically, taking on projects that allowed me to showcase my skills in ways my family couldn't ignore, even if they weren't present to witness it. I joined professional networks and online forums, learning the ins and outs of investments, business management, and entrepreneurship. Slowly, methodically, I was building a foundation for myself, something solid and unshakable that didn't depend on my family's approval. At the same time, I began to pay attention to Kyle's patterns. I started following his business ventures online, quietly observing his spending habits, the projects he invested in, the mistakes he made. I wasn't spying maliciously. I was collecting information, building a mental map of his weaknesses, of the moments where his confidence could be his undoing. And there were many. He was careless, overconfident, and completely unprepared for real scrutiny. Every reckless decision he had made in the past, and continued to make, was a potential lever for me to use when the time came. I also started reconnecting with my own circle of friends and colleagues, people who genuinely valued me for who I was and recognized my skills and intellect. That network became my anchor, my reminder that my worth wasn't dictated by the biased opinions of a family that had repeatedly underestimated me. I realized that I had been defining myself through their lens for far too long, and that lens was warped and dangerous. By rebuilding my confidence and independence, I was reclaiming control over my life, piece by piece. It wasn't easy. Some days were worse than others. There were moments when I still imagined calling my dad and telling him off, moments when I wanted to confront Kyle and expose him immediately, but I held myself back. Anger, I realized, was a tool, but only if wielded strategically. Reacting in the heat of the moment would only make me predictable and reinforce the narrative they had built about me being impulsive or inferior. Patience became my weapon. Observation became my ally. And slowly, the idea of revenge started to take a more refined shape, not about hurting them, but about reclaiming what was mine and making them confront their arrogance. One pivotal moment came about 3 weeks after the family barbecue. I received a call from a colleague at work about a potential freelance project that required someone with precision, attention to detail, and a reputation for integrity. It was high profile, and if I succeeded, it could significantly boost my professional standing. I poured myself into the project, staying up late, double-checking every number, every calculation, every strategy. I wasn't just proving my competence to myself anymore. I was building credibility in the wider world, somewhere my family couldn't ignore. When the project launched successfully, the praise and recognition were immediate. Clients and colleagues alike were impressed, sending emails and messages that lauded my work. I felt a rush of satisfaction that had nothing to do with my family, yet it was deeply personal. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to feel proud, not because my father or Kyle would notice, but because I had accomplished something real, something tangible, something I had built with my own hands and mind. But I didn't stop there. I used the momentum to quietly start an investment portfolio of my own, carefully researching and diversifying in ways Kyle had never considered. I tracked opportunities, learned the pitfalls from his mistakes, and even found a few small ventures that showed promise. Each success, each step forward, reinforced the idea that I didn't need their validation. I could create wealth, security, and recognition on my own terms. Even as I rebuilt myself, I remained acutely aware of my family's ongoing arrogance. Every holiday invitation I declined, every dinner I skipped, every polite conversation I navigated without giving in, they were all small acts of defiance, subtle reminders that I was no longer the passive observer in their little kingdom. I started collecting details, documenting interactions, and quietly noting Kyle's mismanagement of funds, Dad's favoritism, and Aunt Lisa's manipulations. It was becoming clearer that when the time came, I would have all the evidence I needed to confront them not with anger, but with undeniable proof. By the time a month had passed, I was beginning to feel a strange sense of exhilaration. I had been pushed down, humiliated, and excluded, but I wasn't broken. In fact, I was stronger than ever. The humiliation had forged something in me, a careful, strategic, relentless determination to reclaim what had been denied to me. Every success I achieved quietly, every step forward, was another brick in the foundation I was building for my eventual confrontation with my family. And then came the moment that made me realize I was ready to move from quiet rebuilding to subtle action. I received an email from a mutual business contact who had previously worked with Kyle. In it, they mentioned that Kyle had made a series of investments that were not only poorly considered, but potentially fraudulent in nature. The email was tentative, almost cautious, but the implications were staggering. Kyle had left himself exposed, and the information could be leveraged in ways that would make the truth unavoidable for everyone involved. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, my mind already racing through possibilities. The pieces were falling into place. My rebuilding had not only restored my confidence and independence, it had positioned me perfectly to turn the tables. Kyle's recklessness, combined with my strategic patience, could be used to expose him without me ever having to appear aggressive or desperate. It would be precise, calculated, and devastatingly effective. And in that moment, I realized something fundamental. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice, about reclaiming my life and my worth from people who had spent decades telling me I didn't matter. The humiliation, the favoritism, the betrayal, they had all been fuel, and now that fuel was powering a plan that was quietly, meticulously, taking shape. I closed my laptop with a sense of satisfaction that I hadn't felt in years. The path forward wasn't easy, but I knew it was mine to walk. I would rise from the shadows, from the quiet pain and the subtle contempt, and when the time came, I would make them see that the sun they dismissed, the invisible one, was not only present but unstoppable. The thing about finally having a plan is that it changes the way you breathe. For months I'd been treading water, hurt, angry, rebuilding, but without a direction. Once I had that email mentioning Kyle's questionable investments and the pile of receipts and documents I'd already collected, everything snapped into focus. Revenge, in the way I wanted it, wasn't going to be a messy blow-up or a dramatic public meltdown. It would be surgical. It would be undeniable. It would force them to confront facts, not feelings. And for the first time in my life, the idea of making them squirm for having written me out felt almost clean, empowering, necessary. I started with logistics. I turned a spare shelf in my apartment into a command center, folders, color-coded tabs, a notebook with neat columns labeled date/event/evidence/witness/possible leverage. I created a timeline of every significant family interaction over the last 5 years, who said what, when the inheritance had been discussed, which relatives had been excluded from conversations, and where Kyle's spending spikes lined up with his so-called business activities. I printed emails, saved screenshots, and scanned old photos. Every piece felt like a tile in a mosaic that, when assembled, would form an image they couldn't argue with. Gathering allies wasn't about recruiting an army. It was about quiet alliances and credibility. I reached out to 2 people I trusted implicitly. Lena, an old friend who now worked in compliance for a mid-sized bank, and Omar, a former college roommate who had gone on to become a paralegal. Both of them had seen me at my lowest and knew how calm I could be when I needed to be. I didn't spin grand conspiracies. I didn't beg for help. I simply explained the facts I'd uncovered, showed them what I had, and asked for their professional eyes. Lena's reaction was the first real thing that felt like vindication. She looked through Kyle's public filings and the snippets I'd dug up and, after a long silence, said, "Jack, this isn't just careless. This is sloppy enough that someone could question the legality of his reporting." She advised me on how to preserve digital evidence in a way that would be tough to dispute later. Hashes, time-stamped copies, chain of custody notes. Omar, more pragmatic, started drawing up a list of people who would be useful to have on my side discreetly. A local accountant who had worked with Kyle before, a journalist friend who covered small business corruption, and a former associate of my dad's who had grown increasingly skeptical of how the family funds were handled. I was careful. I didn't want the family to sense the net being woven. For all their arrogance, they were perceptive when it came to any threat that smelled like drama. So everything was done in whispers, in emails that had nothing in them but attachments and dates, in phone calls taken on my walk home from work. I learned how to talk like someone who was calm because they were composed, not because they were hiding panic. Which, in a way, I was. But it was a controlled panic, purposeful, focused, and getting stronger every day. Parallel to building my evidence base, I began a campaign of small strategic moves designed to put pressure on Kyle's public persona. I didn't spread rumors. I didn't forge documents. I simply started letting the world around him show his cracks in a way that would be hard to pin on me. At networking events, I asked pointed questions about transparency that made him shift in his seat. I posted articles about ethical investing on my professional social feeds, with measured comments about due diligence. Nothing accusatory, just enough to nudge people who followed both of us to reconsider what they thought. I quietly made sure my contacts who had business dealings with him received my revised resume and portfolio, not to steal clients, but so that the market would start to recognize me as someone who could be trusted where he could not. My father, predictably, remained both oblivious and reactive. He sent the occasional passive text, "Are you coming to Sunday?" which I ignored or delayed. He tried to draw me back in with calls about trivial family updates, as if nothing had changed. I let him. Keeping him comfortable made the eventual reveal hit harder. The calmer the environment, the more stunned they'd be when the dam broke. Aunt Lisa, who fancied herself the family's moral arbiter, did the rounds with other relatives, spreading versions of the narrative that portrayed me as sulking and unstable. She didn't know I'd invited an outsider, a woman named Claire, an accountant I'd met through Omar, to casually cross-check one of Kyle's recent business summaries at a family brunch I'd accepted an invite to attend. Claire was professional and discreet. She agreed to attend under the pretense of being an old friend visiting town. Her presence would be useful later, but for now she was simply another eye. The most delicate piece was preparing for the emotional warfare. They'd try to gaslight me, guilt me, or paint me as vengeful. It's what families like mine do when someone dares to challenge the status quo. I rehearsed responses. I practiced the art of the calm delivery in front of a mirror. Let them talk, listen with a nonchalant face, and then place one fact on the table. Don't wave your arms. Don't shout. Let the evidence speak. Let them argue against documentation if they must. It'll only make them look defensive. My notebook became littered with phrases like, "I thought you should know, I pulled these records, and isn't it strange that," simple sentences, surgical in their effect. At work, I pushed my profile higher without making it look contrived. I volunteered to lead a transparency audit on a small joint venture. Nothing to do with family, everything to do with reputation. It gave me plausible credibility should anyone ask why I cared about documentation and oversight. It also provided the perfect cover. My expertise on governance would make it natural for me to ask questions in family meetings about Kyle's investment performance, appearing curious rather than accusatory. The more I cultivated this professional facade, the more comfortable I felt moving in the circles where Kyle had influence. If you can match their language, you steal their tools. I also found tiny psychological levers to pull. Kyle loved to be seen as generous and family first. He lived off the aura of being a provider. I used that against him by praising him in front of others for small, inconsequential acts. "Nice of you to bring the kids a gift," I'd say, loud enough for his ego to swell. People would watch him preen. Then later I'd drop a neutral question about how that gift was funded. The result was always the same: defensiveness that led to careless admissions or, at least, tension. It's funny how arrogance makes people sloppy. The more they believe their own myths, the more likely they were to slip up. As I assembled the legal and financial puzzle pieces, I also started to think about timing. There had to be a moment that would maximize impact. A charity gala comes to mind, something where the family's reputation is put on display. I noted dates of local events, fundraisers, and community meetings where my family was often in the spotlight. If I could time a reveal around one of those public-facing nights, the shame would reverberate beyond the living room. It would become social currency in the community they prized so highly. They'd feel the humiliation not just personally, but where their peers could see it. That kind of pressure is corrosive, and it would do the job of forcing uncomfortable conversations at Thanksgiving tables and church groups alike. But I wasn't reckless. Before I chose a public stage, I wanted a private blow that would unsettle them and make Aunt Lisa and Dad look like they'd failed to protect what they'd touted as sacred. A personal betrayal, something that would crack the veneer of family unity. I started keeping a folder labeled "Private," a collection of emails and receipts tying Kyle's investments to questionable vendors, and a ledger of how much of the inheritance had been diverted to personal luxuries. There were photographic proofs, hotel reservations with names, invoices for high-end purchases, and messages he'd carelessly sent about covering the difference when one of his projects went belly up. Each piece was a contradiction of the story he loved to tell, that he was responsible, that he managed money for the good of the family. The more I dug, the more I realized how open a target he was. He'd signed contracts with vague clauses, he'd entrusted funds to people I could track, and, crucially, he'd bragged to the exact people who could corroborate his missteps, friends who turned into witnesses if I needed them to. I made discreet calls. I asked pointed questions. I never hinted at what I was building. People were forthcoming. Arrogance invites confession. The ledger started to swell. At the same time, I staged small acts of detachment that would look meaningful when the reveal happened. I declined to host family events. I stopped attending the Sunday dinners where they discussed Kyle's latest vision. I sent text replies that were measured and slightly distant. Sounds like a good plan. Let me know how it goes. It annoyed Dad. It flummoxed Aunt Lisa. Most importantly, it changed the optics. When the time came, I would not look like the desperate sibling trying to drag someone down. I'd be the calm one, the one who had quietly cataloged truth. There were nights I lay awake, thinking of consequences. What if my father disowned me? What if they accused me of fabrication? What if Kyle's pride turned into something darker? I thought of the lonely nights, the emotional cost, the friends who'd be dragged in. But the anger that had once felt raw and destructive had transformed into something colder and more precise. I wasn't trying to punish for punishment's sake. I was trying to correct a narrative that had been weaponized against me my entire life. This was a reclamation, an act of setting the story straight. If the truth cost them their illusions, so be it. As I tightened the net, I began to test their reactions in calibrated ways. A cousin I'd always been close to, Elise, sent me a passive message about Kyle's brave decisions. I responded with a neutral, "Is he seeing a financial advisor for that?" The message thread ended awkwardly. A week later, I made a point of praising a small, irrelevant success of mine in front of Dad at a family lunch, and watched the tiny, jealous flicker that passed through his eyes. These micro-tests weren't cruel, they were data points. Each reaction taught me how to phrase the eventual confrontation so it landed with maximum uncomfortableness. And then came the perfect accidental gift. My father, in an attempt to demonstrate his continued support for Kyle, forwarded me an innocuous photo from one of Kyle's family nights, a group shot with Dad smiling, Kyle's kids clutching toys, and Aunt Lisa beaming beside them. He captioned it, "Family doing well. Thought you'd like to see." It was a small thing, except the photo included, in the background, what looked to be an expensive piece of art that I recognized from a gallery's promotional post the year before, an exhibit that had been paid for by someone my father owed money to. The art, the dates, the gallery's notes, it was a thread. And threads can unravel entire sweaters. I printed the photo and, in tiny handwriting at the bottom of my notebook, penciled a plan. I would not act in haste. I would wait for a family function where the stakes were social credibility and legacy, the kind of event where my father wanted to be seen as the patriarch, the man who made wise financial decisions for the family. I would present the evidence to Aunt Lisa privately, then to Dad, and if they refused to face it, I would make it public in a way that could not be ignored. I pictured their faces when the receipts matched the stories they told themselves. Disbelief, then anger, then the staggered realization of how badly they'd been misled. The image made my gut clench in a way that was both satisfying and terrifying. By late afternoon on a chilly Tuesday, everything felt like it was aligned. Claire had agreed to sit with me once more to review Kyle's ledgers. Lena had promised to prepare a technical report on irregular transfers. Omar had compiled a contact list of witnesses who would corroborate timelines. I slipped the last printed ledger into a folder and labeled it, simply, "When the time comes." The label felt oddly ceremonial. I made myself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the street below, where ordinary life moved with oblivious steadiness. I thought of Dad mowing the lawn that morning, of Aunt Lisa fussing with a tablecloth, of Kyle teaching his child to ride a bike. Mundane, human moments that would be disrupted soon. It made the plan feel less like vengeance and more like a necessary correction to a life lived on lies. There was one more piece I needed, a setting where their pride would be front and center and where the fallout could not easily be swept under the rug. I scanned the local charity events calendar and found it. A gala in 2 weeks, the very fundraiser where Dad had promised to speak about family values and the importance of stewardship. It was the perfect stage. If I timed the revelation to occur either just before his speech or at some point during the evening when the community leaders were gathered, it would force a confrontation that would reach beyond our living room and into the world they cared most about. I could see it all in my head. The outrage, the awkward silences, the whispered questions among people who had always admired my father. The humiliation would be public, startling, and, importantly, difficult to refute quickly. But doing it there also carried risk. If I made a misstep, If the evidence had a gap, the backlash would be severe. My reputation could be ruined as quickly as theirs. And that thought made my hands tremble slightly as I closed the folder. I lit a candle and sat with the weight of what I had built. This was no longer just about proving a point. It was about forcing change in a family that had become comfortable telling itself a story that wasn't true. For better or worse, the next move would alter everything. I felt a pang for the mother who sincerely believed what she'd been told, for the cousins who loved the family uncritically. But I also felt a hard, bright certainty. I had reached the point of no return. The plan was in motion, the allies were ready, and the stage was set. The gala was 2 Fridays away. I could hold it. I could wait. I could sharpen each piece of evidence until there was no frayed edge to be grabbed for a defense. I could rehearse the delivery, the nonchalance, the calm. I poured the rest of my tea and, with a steady hand, slid the "when the time comes" folder into the top drawer of my desk and closed it. For the first time in months, I slept without constant dread, but the dream that night was a fractured collage of banquet halls, whispered conspiracies, and the sound of Dad's polite applause at the wrong moment. Morning came with a strange hush. My phone buzzed, an invitation reminder from Aunt Lisa about the gala. Her message was cheery, oblivious. "Can't wait to see you there, Jack. Dress nice." I stared at the text, the screen reflecting my face like a mirror of intent. I typed, then deleted, then typed again, "I'll be there." I hit send. It was the easiest lie I'd told in months, and the one that felt the most honest. I had agreed to be present for the show, and now all that remained was deciding exactly when to pull the curtain back. The plan sat quiet in the drawer like a sleeping animal, and I knew waking it would change everything. I poured another cup of coffee, looked at myself in the kettle's reflection, and realized how calm I was, how coldly certain. The family believed they were the authors of the narrative. They were about to find out I'd been keeping detailed notes. Somewhere between the second cup and packing my briefcase for work, Claire emailed, "I've got the accounts reconciled. Available to meet Wednesday evening. Lena will have the technical summary." Omar added a short line, "Witness list ready. We should coordinate the sequence." My chest tightened in a way that felt like a starting pistol. I closed my laptop, slid the folder back into the drawer, and then, on a small, irrational impulse, picked up the old family photo from the mantel. Dad with his arm around Kyle at some graduation, Aunt Lisa smiling in the background. For a second the image pierced me with a nostalgic ache. These were my people, messy and flawed and human. But the ache was different now. It was not pity. It was a recognition that I'd spent years shrinking to fit into their story. Tomorrow, I thought, the shrinking would stop. The gala was in 2 weeks. The countdown began, and with each day, the pieces would come closer to aligning. I felt strangely calm as I walked out the door. The plan had a momentum of its own now. All I could do was keep adding small calibrations, double-check the ledgers, ensure witness availability, confirm Claire's attendance, and wait for the night where truth would demand center stage. As I locked my apartment and headed down the stairs, my phone buzzed again. It was a single text from Kyle, "See you Friday. Don't be weird." I smiled despite myself. He had no idea how accurate that text was about to be. I typed a reply, casual and cool. Wouldn't dream of it. Then I hit send and kept walking, the city swallowing my steps as the plan, once quiet and private, began its slow, deliberate walk toward daylight. The drawer clicked shut behind me, and in that small sound I heard the beginning of a reckoning. The night of the gala, I felt the same strange mixture of anticipation and calm that had carried me through the previous weeks. The city glittered outside the hall's tall windows, the lights reflecting like tiny sparks of the storm I had been quietly brewing. I arrived early, deliberately, dressed sharply but not ostentatiously, carrying only my briefcase. Inside were the compiled documents, the reconciled ledgers, the witness list, and Claire's notes. Every piece had been meticulously verified. Nothing could be dismissed as hearsay or emotion. Everything was fact. Cold, undeniable, irrefutable fact. My family, of course, was already there. Dad was in his element, the charming patriarch of the evening, shaking hands and making small talk with donors. Aunt Lisa fluttered around like she owned the room, dropping compliments and asking for toasts with her usual self-satisfied precision. Kyle stood near the center, regaling a small group of acquaintances with tales of his responsible investments and the sacrifices he'd made for family. I could see it all, cataloging the pride, the smugness, the unearned confidence. My pulse remained steady. I had waited for this moment, and every minute of anticipation made the next move sweeter. I positioned myself near the bar, casually sipping a glass of sparkling water, and waited for the right moment. Claire was seated at a nearby table, eyes scanning the room but alert, signaling subtly with hand gestures we had prearranged. Lena and Omar were out of sight, quietly monitoring the event through phone calls and text updates. Every ally was in place. All I had to do was initiate the sequence. The first move was subtle, a casual conversation with a prominent guest who had connections to Kyle's ventures. I was curious about some of the small business filings in town, I said lightly. I noticed a few discrepancies in a few of Kyle's recent projects. Nothing confirmed yet, but I'm keeping an eye on it. The guest's eyebrows raised, and I offered a polite shrug. That was all it took. Rumors in the right circles moved faster than any accusation shouted across a room. Kyle, unfortunately for him, was in the perfect position to overreact, and overreaction was exactly what I wanted. Then came the pivot. As Dad moved toward the podium to give his speech on stewardship and family responsibility, I excused myself and quietly asked Claire to place the folder in a location where Aunt Lisa would inevitably notice it. Her favorite waiting room near the coat check, a place she always lingered before introductions. I then made my way toward the center of the room, in plain sight, as though I were just another attendee. Aunt Lisa, as predicted, noticed the folder immediately. She picked it up, glanced at it, and her eyes widened in a way that betrayed her carefully maintained composure. For a moment, she thought it might be irrelevant paperwork. Then she flipped it open. The documents fell into place, the ledgers, the invoices, the reconciled accounts, the clearly labeled mismanagement. Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again. She made a sound like a gasp, which drew a few curious onlookers. I didn't rush. I didn't confront her. I simply approached and said softly, "You might want to look at this carefully." Her fingers trembled slightly as she flipped through the papers. I could see the realization dawn on her face, then the panic. She knew, in that moment, that this wasn't something she could manage with charm or misdirection. Kyle, noticing the commotion, hurried over. "Lisa, what is?" His voice faltered when he saw me standing beside her. I met his gaze evenly, quietly, with no trace of anger, only calm precision. "It's just some documentation about your recent investments," I said. "I thought you'd want to see it before Dad gives his speech." The words were simple, neutral, almost casual, but the effect was instantaneous. Kyle's confident smirk vanished. Dad, mid-podium, turned to see what was happening. I watched the blood drain from his face as Aunt Lisa, who had been his staunchest supporter, held the folder up for him to see. For the first time in years, the patriarch looked like an ordinary man, startled, uncertain, exposed. The evidence spoke for itself. Receipts and invoices showed luxury spending disguised as family expenses. Ledger entries revealed transfers that contradicted Kyle's public claims. Emails and texts exposed casual acknowledgments of mismanagement and deliberate obfuscation. Claire stepped forward discreetly and added her professional opinion. The reconciled accounts clearly demonstrated discrepancies that couldn't be ignored. Her calm, factual delivery left no room for misinterpretation. Kyle stuttered, trying to explain, but every word he spoke only reinforced the documentation. The guests, many of whom were influential in local business circles, began to murmur. Questions were asked, polite, controlled, but loaded. I watched as the carefully constructed narrative Kyle had spent years cultivating began to unravel in real time. His pride, his shield, shattered before a room full of witnesses. Aunt Lisa's usual assertiveness crumbled. She glanced at Dad, then at Kyle, realizing the full extent of the exposure. For the first time, she had no ready defense, no poised commentary to redirect blame. Dad's face was ashen, his voice quivering when he tried to intervene. "Jack, this isn't how," he trailed off, flustered. I interrupted gently, not raising my voice. "It's exactly how, Dad. I just collected the facts." The room fell into a tense, almost reverent silence. The social currency my family had relied on, their charm, their stories, their assumed moral authority, was gone, replaced by the cold clarity of documented truth. People who had admired them looked uncertain. People who had trusted Kyle now questioned everything. The humiliation wasn't just personal, it was public, undeniable, irreversible. Kyle's shoulders slumped. He attempted a weak smile, tried to argue, but his words sounded hollow. Dad tried to salvage something, tried to insist that the situation could be explained away, but the documents spoke louder than anything he could say. Aunt Lisa's usual manipulative commentary evaporated. She could only stand frozen, clutching the folder like a lifeline. I felt a quiet satisfaction, not from cruelty, but from justice. For years, I had been dismissed, belittled, and erased. Now, for the first time, my family had to acknowledge the truth. The narrative they had spent decades controlling had been corrected, quietly but irrevocably, by someone they had underestimated, me. After the initial shock, the fallout was swift. Kyle faced serious scrutiny from business contacts. A few ventures he had touted were temporarily frozen pending independent review. Dad's credibility in the community took an immediate hit. He had championed Kyle's decisions publicly, and now they were clearly flawed. Aunt Lisa, known for her judgmental lectures, had to retreat quietly, her authority undermined by the very evidence she had failed to scrutinize. Even the extended family, previously complicit in ignoring my exclusion, began asking questions, subtle, probing, but unmistakably shifting in focus toward Kyle and the mismanaged inheritance. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I remained calm, polite, and neutral, answering questions only when necessary. Every time Kyle attempted to redirect blame toward me, the documents proved him wrong. Every attempt to gaslight or deflect was met with calm, factual clarity. By the end of the evening, the tension had shifted entirely. I wasn't the wrong child anymore. I was the one holding the narrative. I had taken what was mine by right, credibility, visibility, and the undeniable truth, and presented it with precision and care. When the gala concluded, I quietly collected my belongings. I glanced at my father, who avoided eye contact, at Kyle, who slouched with embarrassment, at Aunt Lisa, who tried to smile but failed. I knew that the family hierarchy had shifted. The years of favoritism, manipulation, and exclusion were no longer unchallenged. I had planted a seed that would grow into a permanent recalibration of how they viewed me, and perhaps how they viewed themselves. Walking out into the crisp night air, I felt a sense of release I hadn't known in years. The weight of their favoritism, the sting of betrayal, the humiliation I had endured, it was no longer mine to bear. I had reclaimed my agency, my dignity, and my voice. And most importantly, I had done it with precision, strategy, and calm. I hadn't needed to yell, beg, or plead. I hadn't needed to destroy them completely. I had only needed to reveal the truth, and the truth had done the rest. For the first time in a long while, I felt free. Free from the shadow of my family's expectations, free from their narratives, free from the constant feeling of being overlooked. I knew there would be conversations, apologies, defenses, and attempts to rebuild pride. But none of that would undo what had been revealed. The truth was permanent, and I had wielded it carefully. As I walked toward my car, I thought back to the countless nights spent cataloging, analyzing, and rebuilding. The anger that had once felt consuming had transformed into patience, precision, and quiet satisfaction. The weight of the past had been lifted not by confrontation, but by preparation and timing. I opened my car door, placed the briefcase on the passenger seat, and took a deep breath. The city lights shimmered around me, and I smiled softly to myself. For the first time, I realized that reclaiming one's power didn't have to be loud or dramatic. It could be quiet, methodical, and undeniably effective. And in that moment, I felt the rare and exhilarating clarity of knowing I had won, and I had done so on my own terms. The night was calm, the air crisp, and the streets emptying as I drove away. The family I had once feared, the people who had dismissed me, underestimated me, and humiliated me, they had finally learned a simple truth. Never underestimate the quiet one who has been watching all along.